So thanks, and thanks to the Rachel Carson Center for inviting. Ich kenne eigentlich die Anfrage. Wenn Sie Anfrage haben, dann können Sie mir stellen, aber jetzt hatte ich. So I want to first off Anka and for everybody for hospitality. And this, and as we were talking, a discussion that either of my websites, one is practicalreason.com, which has a sort of a list of all my works on my site, but you can also go to environmentalthought.com, which is basically which is a little bit uncommon for philosophers, but it's I and students and a few colleagues who have been working collaboratively on a number of issues in conservation and restoration and e-waste and so on. And so we have only some papers there, but some videos that have been showing the normative or the ethical dimensions of climate change. And if you're kind of interested in the videos, it's an ongoing project, a long sort of labor of love. It's quite difficult. It's a challenge for me. It's uncommon, but you can check it out and see what crazy stuff we're doing at the University of Colorado. So without too much further ado on that topic, I'm going to just briefly give you a sense of what's going on in this book, and by way of also kind of an apology. So I have this book, The Wild and the Wicked, on Nature and Human Nature, which is it's relatively and I'm going to give you an overview of that book in this 20-minute talk today, which means I'm not going to get a lot of detail, right? So I'm just going to kind of give you a rough sketch of what's going on in the book, hopefully, to stimulate some ideas that may be percolating in some of your own work or what have you. And I should also, by way of introduction to the book, mention that this book is, unlike many books coming out of the philosophy universe, a trade manuscript. And what I mean by that is geared to sort of a wide readership with the objective of complicated philosophical ideas to an audience of readers who otherwise might not be in philosophy. So it's a deviant manuscript in many respects because it uses a lot of very, very loose language to get at very, very complicated notions in philosophy. Hopefully it will be accessible to people who otherwise find philosophy to just be dry, boring, and hostile, which a lot of people do. I should mention the University Frankfurt, and that I'm a fellow for a month fellowship, which is run out of the Normative Orders group at Frankfurt by Rainer Forst, and I'm working there with Rainer Forst and Darren Mollendorf. So without further ado, just get into this overview of the book. And also, I mentioned this sort of during the Q&A. I can talk. I'm happy to talk about a lot of things about content-wise in the book, substantively what's going on in the book. But I'm also happy to talk about sort of the project of communicating ideas to or theoretical ideas to an audience that otherwise might not be with the philosophy. Apologies if I'm speaking too fast normally. Okay, so the book, Wild and the Wicked, is a book oriented around the question of environmental value in many respects. And essentially, it's a criticism of a lot of views within the environmental community or in the environmental movement, right? And the way in which I approach the sort of the manuscript is first to observe, which I think is not too terribly controversial, that many people in the environmental community have seen and noticed that for the most part, historically, nature has not been viewed as something of value. It's been viewed as a kind of valueless substrate, right? So when people are sort of starting out in environmental writing, they will point out that we just kind of treat nature as a kind of a resource, right? And they'll different ways. Source, basically H.L. Mencken, who is a very famous author, who's Baltimore Sun, described nature as a place to throw empty beer cans on a Sunday, and other further, this observation simply as a kind of standing reserve. People will observe the way in which will observe in which we've also thought of other objects, not just in nature, but as part of our community, also as a kind of standing reserve. So they'll observe, for instance, that we once thought of animals as a kind of standing reserve, sometimes of other people as a right. And so the thought is that I think drives a lot of environmentalists that we can challenge a sort of status quo view by demonstrating that nature has a value of some sort, just as we've demonstrated historically that humans have value, let's say, or that meat has value, or what have you. Some kind of intrinsic value, or sometimes extrinsic value, or what have you, right? And what I'm going to argue in this book, or what I do argue in the book, is that we don't have to accept nature's value at all, right, to see that we have expansive responsibilities to the environment, right? So this is the premise of the manuscript, right? There are a lot of other arguments for being concerned about nature, for preserving nature, for being concerned about climate change, or what have you, right? Some of them are self-interested arguments, right? We should do what we can to try to protect nature because it's in our interest. We should do, or future generations arguments, we should do what we can to protect nature because it matters to people who are living in the future, right? But the same kind of value argument that I'm making here applies to arguments as well. They have slightly different problems. I'm just not as concerned with those. The global warming argument as discussion is not isolated from these concerns about value, about the value of nature. In the book, I sort of characterize this value orientation as what I might call the precious vase view, right? This idea that nature is this place, right, or thing that has a value that can be isolated. It could be an intrinsic value, a value intrinsic to it, or an extrinsic value that it gives value or something like that, that could be broken or taken away. And you find, of course, incident occurrences of this expression of nature's value all throughout environmental writing, out the environmental history, environmental literature, environmental poetry, and what have you. Here's John Muir. I'm going to run through a bunch of quotes here because if you're not persuaded this commitment to nature's value is pervasive through the environmental literature, then maybe I'll persuade you by citing these people. So John Muir, need beauty as well as bread, places to play in and to pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. Expression of nature's value. Here's Henry David. What is sublime and noble, only filling and drenching of the reality that we never have enough of nature. Says Schweitzer, compassion in which all ethic root can only attain its full breadth and depth of it, and depth if it embraces all living creatures and does not itself to mankind. Says Aldo Leopold, who's telling me he was upset to learn that the Leopoldstrasse is not named after Aldo Leopold. Which is too bad, I should say. Aldo Leopold says a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. Ed Abbey, of course, sort of an icon in the American wilderness discussion. The beauty of delicate arch explains nothing, for each thing in its way, when true to its own character, is equally beautiful, right? Here's Jacques Cousteau. He says, a lot of people see, I'm in love to it. I put Rachel Carson here. I should. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as it lasts. And as a friend of mine in the community once said, dude, when we got out into nature, right? What I found, like being an environmental activist, which I was for a long time, was that I felt increasingly uncomfortable with this kind of expression of awe in the face of nature. Why did I feel that way? I'll get to that in just a second. I want to just talk about the motivation here. The motivation for this view, this expression of the beauty or the value or the intrinsic value, the extrinsic value of nature, the motivation for this view is completely understandable and laudable. The idea is that if we can show that nature is valuable in some way, then why harming or disrespecting nature is not justified. The idea is that we're somehow degrading or devaluing something good. Basic intuition. That's an intuition that guides a lot of ethicists too. The thought is that we should, whatever it is to act well or to do the right thing, it is to promote the good. Right? That's a pretty common view. And the implication here, of course, is that once we establish value, we can then promote or protect that value. Then we have our sort of marching orders, right? If we know that there's something good out in nature, then we know what to do, right? You see this appear in the preservation. This in the restoration debate, you see it in the endangered species discussion, you see it to a certain extent in the climate change discussion. So there's a problem, though, right? The problem is, what if nature isn't all that it's cracked up to be, right? Nature is pretty awful. So the sort of the strategy of this script, of this book, is to acknowledge this. To acknowledge in a way that most environmental writers have not been acknowledging that nature is horrible. Right? In many cases, and even suggest that you can run the argument for environmentalism if you acknowledge the horrors of nature. So just let's look at some images of how bad nature is. It's bad, right? Tsunamis, right, which kill a lot of people. This is a tsunami, right? And just tsunamis. Of course, it's all sorts of other kinds of natural disasters as well. Volcanoes, forest fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, this is more hurricane stuff, earthquakes, drought, here's the American West drought, plague, malaria. But this leaves us kind of wondering, like, what are we supposed to do with this information? Because, of course, this is knowledge more or less by the environmental community. We've kind of this for us. Either we accept that nature has a terrible side, right? And it seems that if we accept that, then we might have to abandon the environmental project, or so it would seem, at least to some people, right? Some people just want to push against that. Or we might just reject nature's side as overall bad, right? Or as unbalanced bad. One might say, well, unbalanced is better than it is worse, right? It's the between good and bad that we might find the value of nature. There are so many things about nature, we should try to protect it for that reason, right? But let's just look a little bit deeper at the characters of nature this way. So I'm going to take a pivot here, and I'm going to pivot in a way that's a little jarring, but just bear with me. There are other really, really bad things in the world. Like that is a bad thing. That's that's a bomb. I don't know what it is. I like mushrooms, but that's not a mushroom. So this Hiroshima, after the bombing of this is a very, very bad thing, and there's a lot to say about it. There are unspeakable atrocities that have occurred over the history of the world that are very, very bad. Equally bad, if not worse, one might argue, than some of nature's atrocities. Banda Aceh, the tsunami, or the Haiti earthquake, or what have you, right? These are just kind of apples and oranges. Hiroshima and Nagasaki kind of offset a lot of greater global tragedies. So many other tragedies in the world, right? So many other bad things that humans have done to each other. The list of humanly cruel events is equally as expansive as nature's cruelty, if not more so, right? And we can just kind of go on. I can show you picture after picture how horrible humans have been to one another. So what we might have found here by looking at pictures is some new for the environmentalists to get a hook on them, right? Basically, it's starting to look bad for humanity here. Maybe we should just be misanthropists, right? We should be sort of acknowledge that humans are pretty awful, right? And then look to nature for some guidance on the good. The claim might be here, maybe however bad nature may be, humans are clearly worse, right? But as it happens, right, there are also some really fantastic things that human beings do, right? We help one another, we assist the poor, we assist the starving. When there's a tragedy, we sometimes go to help out in fires and whatnot. We help at an individual level, at a social level. If we see somebody who's fallen, often we'll help them, we'll help the elderly, and so on. We'll even help species or individual animals to survive. So this claim, I apologize for the erratic nature of this PowerPoint. Normally that's automated, that flipping through, but I'm clicking and flipping, and so it's like, it's acting funny. Anyway, so we're through the slideshow though. So the claim then might be, however may be, humans are worse, right? But that seems to be false on its face too, right? Because humans can be good. Also, the question on the value of nature, and in so doing kind of assigns a negative value to humans. So this is all very confusing to do with these observations, right? We could sort of like dig our heels in and try to stick with them, or we abandon this approach to doing ethics altogether, right? Maybe just this idea of the human versus the non-natural versus the non-natural, right? But if we do, then where are we supposed to go, right? So I think we can now start to make some different kinds of distinctions than we do in the environmental community. I think distinctions that give us greater purchase on what I take the ultimate environmental conundrum to be, right? And the way I'm going to get purchase on this is by leaning into a philosopher named P.F. Strawson, because I think he helped us unearth or think a little bit differently about in our world. So this is P.F. Strawson in 1960, an article, very well-known article known as Freedom and Resentment. The article is, for the most part, about free will, right? He explores the question of free will, causality, right? But it's also an article that very much exposes the conditions under which we excuse and condemn behavior. Right? And what essentially, well, so I want you to think back, basically, to all those images that I seem to sort of recklessly show you, right? Pointlessly show you. Back to those images. What was your reaction to those images? Were the reaction of sympathy, of concern, of fear or anxiety, right? You have like This is anger, fury. I feel very angry about some of those images that I show you. Get indignant even, right? Maybe even rageful, right? Were there some cases in which you felt feelings of praise or approval or understanding? Right? There are always at least two attitudes that we can take with regard to sort of events in the world, right? We can take this kind of what he calls an objective attitude, or a reactive attitude, right? And we do this at all times. We're between these different attitudes that we might take when we witness events. The objective attitude, he points out, is a kind of third-person God's point of view. It enables us to make claims about the world to help explain and understand the way the world happens. This is kind of what happens when we see events in nature, right? We see them happen, we make sense of them, we understand them physicalistically, maybe mechanistically, maybe chemically, or what have you. We can explain what's happened there, and we understand and characterize them as kinds of events, right? Without a very rich, deep, normative valence, except in as much as bad or good is brought about, right? But the reactive attitude suggests, right, is something else that helps us distinguish between events from actions. The reactive attitude is something that applies almost uniquely human actions, right? It's an attitude that we take, which we assign a kind of position of approval or disapproval, approbation or disapprobation, as to use his language, in which we resent or praise or become indignant at the activities of others. And the way in which we do this is primarily not by simply looking at the bad states of affairs that we about, because that, of course, is that's the view that we take primarily when we're assuming the objective attitude. It's rather by looking at the reasons that people have for taking the actions that they've taken. These are the sort of the linchpin that help us understand why somebody might have taken some action or not have taken some action. So I look closely at these reactive attitudes versus these objectivating attitudes in the book. Typically suggests that, sort of states of the world, events in the world admit of explanation, a descriptive explanation, tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes, fire, plague, whereas human actions admit of or request or require, demand of us a kind of justification for their eventuation, right? Wars, medical interventions, institutions of policies, private decisions, and so on. Says Rawson at the end of his paper, if your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you fight him, you can quarrel with him, and though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel to reason with him. So here we have the entry point to our thinking about environmental problems a little bit differently. We understand environmental problems not as a problem necessarily of some bad state of the world coming to pass, but rather of a failure of reason. It's a failure of us reasoning with one another, right? And the access that we're going to be able to get here to this ethical problem is through choices, right? In sort of chapter 5 and 6 of the book, I look at how our everyday choices are kind of caught up in supposition, responsibility, and justificatory appeals. Of course, we make choices all the time about what to buy, about where to live, and so on and so forth. But there are many sort of trivial choices like that. But there are a lot of other more complicated decisions that we make over the course of our lives that inform us about how to be, about how to live, what kind of person to be, whether to be a vegetarian or what to drive, who to vote for, whether to hunt for food or pleasure, whether to lie for personal gain, what God to believe in, if to believe in a God at all, whether to waste water, and so on. Not simply choices, I want to suggest, between a variety of options. They're not just between option A and option B, but rather dependent or contingent upon a range of considerations, including limited to values, right? And the problem, at least as far as I've been able to ascertain, is that a huge discussion has focused a lot on the value, important, to the exclusion of all of these other considerations, these principled considerations, these virtue considerations, and what. So I don't want to dwell on this too long. I just want to suggest that basically we should the environmental discussion, as I do in the book, should turn a lot of attention to reason. And I'm going to skip some of this. I didn't mean to skip that far. I'm going to skip some of this discussion about ethics and sort of the basis of ethics. That's too much to cover right now. But basically, the idea that I'm challenging some views more or less stood as pillars of ethics quite many centuries. And I'm doing this in the tradition of some recent authors, Stephen Darwall, Tim Scanlon, Jürgen Habermas, who's at Frankfurt, and Rainer Forst, who's at Frankfurt. which is one of the reasons I'm interested in being there. And all of these authors are kind of working in this justificatory literature and writing in the same kind of tradition that I'm writing. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about justification, except to say that the mistake has been in assuming that what makes an action justified is going to hang on the balance of values, right? And it characterizes justification as a kind of status. We say some act is justified, and put a stamp of justification on that action, and instead of construing justification as a kind of a process, a deliberative process in which we might come to some conclusion about what to do. So I'm trying to build an argument for environmentalism as a fundamentally deliberative process, as opposed to simply, an observation of the status of some action. And again, I'm pushing forward here a little bit because I have one thing that I want to read to you that will give you a sense of how the book is written. So what I do at the very end of the book is I introduce this parable, and then I'll be on time. I have like 5 minutes. Is that all right? You sure? Okay. All right. So I have 5 minutes because I can stop. Okay. So here's 5 minutes. So here's the parable. And again, I apologize. I'm not able to sort of flesh out the idea of justification in quite the way that I want to, but I want to read you this parable. So, identical respects, each world is filled with people and animal and fungi and trees, decorated with rivers and rains and shadows and clouds, punctuated with buzzing insects and crashing waves and booming thunderclaps. Each is beautiful to a degree, but each is also somewhat ugly at times. On balance, each is a difficult place to survive, with scarcity and injury and death around every turn. Save the nastiness, there are moments of pleasure and joy as well. Life expectancy is short, around 40 years, and children sometimes do not make it through their early years. The same sort that tracked misery during the Boxing Day tsunami and the bombing of Hiroshima. I have a discussion of the Boxing Day tsunami and the bombing of Hiroshima in the book. And the idea here is, of course, that there are many people who think that you can understand the problems with these kinds of events simply by isolating the sort of the utility value of these events. You say like, oh, like X number of people died, or X number of people were made homeless, or X number of people were sort of made sick, or what have you. And this is a way of it's wrong. It's wrong. So misery is in the background, pain and happiness, mirroring and happiness. On balance, happiness in each of these two worlds. In one critical way, the world of people take action primarily for bad reasons. They harbor ill, unjustified, selfish disrespect for others. In the other world, the world of wild, people take action primarily for good reasons. They harbor well wishes, concerned that their actions will be acceptable to a wide range of affected parties, and justifiable respect for others. Where wicked is miserable by virtue of the people who live in it, wild is miserable by dint of some other feature. Pathogens say, or it is prone to a more active and hostile climate. Imagine that these two worlds are completely unconnected to each other, in separate universes even, though better and worse states of the world occur in parallel. For every evil deed done in wicked, there is a bad event in wild. For every bad event in wild, some evil deed is done in wicked. For every mentioned brigand pulls a trigger in wicked. Harmless child, so too goes and kill us similarly in heart. By this world, wicked is miserable because people make it. Maim and hate and loathe. Wild is because it is naturally so. It is cruel. Try as they might, people work together at improvement. The misery and happiness meters are perfect. When wicked's meter hits 20, the people in wicked are like each some of the time, inconsiderate animals out of care but for the gratification. Nothing to succeed or fail at. Conquer and beat. People in wild resemble what many of we actually are. Actions, they run the reason party strengths and weaknesses of that position. They're taking into consideration the effect of their actions on others. Which world is worth living in? Where would you have only two options? This world of wicked. To my mind, world. It's a deep world. Much I hope we agree. This world of that it's not a good world, unbalanced outweighs happiness. That wild is an ethically neutral world, and because of this, that is preferable to wicked. I, for one, would in wild than wicked. I would rather be a citizen in wild than wicked. I would rather face the peril of tar pits and quicksand than suffer the indignity of man against man. In wild life, don't wrong one another. They try to do right. Terrible place to be. The citizens struggle mightily against all odds. There's no murder, for no one wishes on another. There's no misery, for no one pursues the material goods of the problem is parable and allegory. People in the world, in the wild, not so distant from our own. People and wicked also have experience. They sometimes guide their actions, as many of us do, some of the time. But there's a world we have to consider. I just want to see if I'm this or not. Imagine now just one other, both of our previous fantasy worlds and every miserable one. Imagine that in this world, the people, and they do not act with reason, allow themselves to be dragged along by desire, by the stimulation of outside forces through their institutional infrastructure, them assess the intensity of their and trade of their own desire, of others. Their actuarial method, chits for transferring their desires, the unfulfilled desires off the dreams of those regimes to ensure the fulfillment of built on desire. They have built political reasonable to merely engagement with little more than choosing support. They have constructed highways that flatten reasonable to exchange into the common data accumulation and knowledge logging. The idea is that's the world we're living in now. We're living in a world in which we have flattened out discourse, we've flattened out deliberation, and it's fundamentally a conundrum, I think, that the environmentalist is mostly responding to. This idea that we can point out our environmental problems and somehow engage the rest of the population, the rest of the civil sphere, in some kind of discourse, right? And what we're finding, I think, very often in the environmental community is that people are engaging, and they're not engaging in part. We have mechanisms that prohibit that kind of engagement. So I'm not going to focus too much on, I won't focus on that at all, on deliberation. That's the idea, right? We just the concern of the environmentalists, as I think the concern of a lot of the human rights activists and so on, is fundamentally the same. We're not engaged in justification and deliberation in quite the way that we ought to be. So I'm closing down here, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm going backwards. That wasn't my problem. So, that was where I wanted to go. Yeah, there we go. All right. So without further ado then, I'll tell you, basically the book, I said, an attempt to try to establish that deliberation is not, we haven't engaged in deliberation in quite the way, and we continue not to engage in deliberation in quite the way that we ought to be engaging in deliberation. It's an attempt to characterize, reframe the environmental discussion not as a discussion about value, but rather as a discussion about justification. That's where I want to go.